Hi, I'm Chris Page, also known as DC Breaks, and I'm here at the EBS Institute to do a really deep dive into Reese Bass and modern drum and bass sound design. And so with that, we can then kind of explore kind of the same principles of having a number of layers of different oscillators being filtered, distorted, and then kind of modulating or changing some of the parameters on filters and distortion to create entirely new sounds. So at this point, we're going to kind of move away from the kind of classic Reese and kind of look at kind of Reese sound design a bit more generically. So I mentioned at the start, we have a number of different sound source options within Faceplant. We've seen some of these classic analog shapes, which we can use. But we can also introduce a wavetable. So a wavetable essentially is just a way of kind of blending between different wave shapes. So if I move on to frame one, so if you see here, I've got 256 different frames, and each one has its own shape. And so it starts off as a saw, and then as you move through, you can see that saw shape kind of changes to become effectively a saw that's been shifted in phase by 180 degrees, essentially. So we'll get into some wavetable design later on, but essentially all we need to know at this point is that we could modulate this by perhaps using an LFO and kind of sweep through different characteristics of this wavetable to create interesting textures. So again, we're just going to use an LFO, and that's going to be controlling this frame rate up here. So if I just turn off everything else for the moment, we can hear kind of how that sounds. I'll just literally turn off the sine as well. Okay. Oh, a bit quiet. So I'll just turn it up on this channel here. So there's two things kind of going on here. There's the movement within the frame itself, and then there's also, I've added in some unison. So a bit like as we saw on the sampler, got two voices. They're very, very slightly detuned, just like a couple of cents, like things like 3.9 cents or something like that. And within Faceplant, there's like a whole bunch of different unison settings. So there's this hard mode, there's a smooth mode, synthetic mode, and these all have distinctive kind of characteristics. There's these other creative ones, so like frequency stack, pitch stack, and a shepherd, which is referencing a shepherd tone, which if you don't know what that is, something else to maybe talk about. It's a bit of a digression for now. And then for chords, there's all these other kind of sort of harmonic layers of adding in voices that are also pitched, essentially. So this is good for kind of making chords or pads, for example. Not so good for making bass sounds. And so, yeah, use of unison and kind of creating interesting wavetables can be another area we can kind of explore. You might have noticed that didn't really have much depth though, so we can use a sine wave to add some warm kind of sub bass to it, and then using the same kind of principles, add in some distortion, and again we're just a little bit of EQ and running it through our limiter and reverb. So using our macros, for example, this is another way we can control things. I mentioned before these lanes. I can control the mix on this lane, so everything's kind of going through lane 1, lane 2, lane 3. If I don't turn this up, it's just going to sound clean, but I can start to add in this distortion processing here, essentially. Ooh. That's why I said we need a limiter. And we can kind of make this more and more extreme. Probably too extreme at that point. But when we start to do this, we can start to explore textures that we wouldn't necessarily be able to easily recreate by kind of creating really complex ways of kind of like fine-tuning between a lot of these different parameters and kind of modulating them as well. As we'll see, things start. I'm starting quite slowly because we're going to get quite complicated soon, and I just want you to understand what it is I'm kind of doing here. So this lane here has just this Faturator plugin that we've snapping that we've already seen, and essentially I'm just mixing the amount of signal that's passing through this lane. So it's not actually all the way down, but if I turn that all the way down, it'll be kind of cleaner. If I turn off the unison as well. There's no mix. So if I bring the mix up, it's going to mix in some of this lane into the signal, essentially. If I make that really obvious as well, you kind of hear that. It could be a little bit loud there. You can hear that as a sweep it, essentially. So the only other thing I've set up here is just a control to determine, so this is the wavetable frame oscillation, so like how much movement I'm getting here. It's so distorted now you can't really hear it, but you can see that it's starting to sweep through some of the different characteristics. Now this one is it's called combing saw. It's just one of the preset saws that comes within Phase Plant, but we could get something out that has a bit more of a difference to it, and just increase the frame range. So you can start to hear how you can use different aspects of the wavetable to create kind of different textures. I think we'll come back to wavetable design a bit later on and move on to looking at some other techniques now. There tends to be, I guess, the sound design part within Phase Plant, and you can, certainly, control the stereo image within Phase Plant as well. A lot of these sounds start to sound a bit washy if they get too stereo, particularly on the low end. Or I tend to do a lot of that stuff kind of once I've kind of got sounds down, like processing the audio after I've kind of designed it to start with. But for at this point, and generally speaking, it's much easier to work in a kind of very much mono way to start with, rather than, and you can always make things stereo easy, like later. If you work very stereo, it becomes a harder challenge to kind of mono it off, potentially, although you can do like mid-side processing and things like that as well. Essentially, if I routed this to, let's say, there's nothing in lane 1, so if I had this going to lane 2, this is going to lane 1, I can just send lane 1 to master. So yeah, that's pretty much that. Anybody else have any other questions on anything we've done so far? No? Yeah.
That previous question, but adding stereo later, what would you?
So well.
If you worked entirely mono, what would you do to sort of
Stereoise it. Yeah, there's lots of different things. So, so when I was adding unison, for example, there's a spread control here, so you can spread the stereo image of the voices. That's one way. That works quite well for this type of sound. So this is a little bit extreme now. In fact, I might just turn that off. I don't know how easy it is to hear whether or not. We could probably look at it in here. If I just open this up. So this is a goniometer, effectively, that's going to show us how stereo or otherwise the signal is. We could also, I'll just add in something down here, doesn't really matter for now, like an ensemble snap-in, so we can again add multiple voices and spread these. Signal's quite quiet, you can't see, but anything out like to the sides here is like increasingly stereo effectively. And yeah, I mean, there's tons of different ways. Effectively, there's kind of stereo control here, so you can kind of affect the stereo width of the mids or the wide parts. You can pan things as well. And yeah, I think a bit of, generally speaking, really mono, low end, and almost like a funnel kind of going out is generally quite a good way of kind of adding richness and kind of, yeah, a bit of interest to the sound. But they do tend to work better if the meat of it is quite mono, because you want it kind of coming out of both speakers equally to kind of get that impact, generally speaking. Cool, so let's move on then and look at adding in some frequency modulation to this. So I mentioned at the start we can kind of do additive synthesis, subtractive synthesis, and we can kind of also do frequency modulation. It doesn't work in necessarily quite the same way, but it's a similar principle. So we've got a pretty much same kind of sound here. And what I've done is I've created a separate group which I've called FM control, and it's just a sine wave. But what I've done is I've routed this sine wave to change the shift, which is essentially just a pitch shift, if you like, of both our triangle layer and a sine layer. I've just kept it as single oscillators for now. We don't need that detuning beating, because we're going to be adding beating through frequency modulation. So if I just turn this off for a second, I'll just show you something. So if I hit, so this is just our triangle layer here. If I start to change the shift, you can hear it obviously pitching up and down. And from a sound theory point of view, again, if you imagine that this is one cycle, or however many cycles of our triangle layer, the more cycles we have, the higher the frequency, and so we hear it higher. And effectively, if we slow it down, drag it out, it's getting longer and longer, and shift, that's going to make it sound lower pitch. So phase plant's quite good at that. It kind of forces you to think about the theory of the sounds that you're making. And also you can visually see, as I whack the shift up, we're getting more and more and more and more and more cycles, and so that's a higher frequency sound, right? And so it sounds high frequency. So we can effectively modulate that pitch using our sine wave. So that's what we mean by frequency modulation. We're changing the frequency using our sine wave. And when we do that, we can get some really interesting, really guttural kind of tones. So in terms of the signal flow, it's exactly the same as going through a low-pass filter and then into some distortion, and that's pretty much it. Do I have a MIDI clip here to play? No, let's just take one now. Now, things can start to get a little bit loud with frequency modulation, so I'm going to start a bit quiet, hopefully, and see how we get on. Okay. So as we, if we want to then control, at the moment it doesn't really sound, we can see the kind of waves have changed, but we can't really hear necessarily, it just sounds a bit almost like distorted, like it's kind of a little bit grainier. I've assigned a macro to change the sync. So sync is a little bit like a kind of a pitch shift. In fact, I could have done this on the shift here as well, or even the semitones on here. But sync works slightly differently, and you can experiment with these different pitch modes if you like to kind of see how they work differently. But if I turn up the sync mode here, you see it kind of copies an individual cycle, but within like a grid almost. So you can almost imagine some imaginary lines being drawn through here, and it kind of repeating within that grid. And you can see as I do that, it's changing the kind of sonic content, if you like, the number of oscillations, the beatings that we're getting effectively in our original analog oscillators. So let's hear how that actually sounds. So that's 1%. So we're now kind of getting that beating, but we can kind of sweep through this kind of. And at certain points, we're going to get like something that sounds a bit more pleasing. Some of them sound really inharmonic and grating and don't really have anything. But because it's quite an extreme way of doing things, I also have introduced a frequency modulation fine-tune macro. And this essentially is just going to be controlling the detune of my unison. So I can use this as a way of just kind of taming, almost like a fine-tune for the frequency modulation. So the other thing that's really important to say at this point is that depending on what note gets played, we're going to get a different amount of beating, because it's dependent on the frequency of what we're playing. So I'm just going to find a note on the keyboard instead. Okay, so not much beating going on there. Okay, so something like that might be quite cool. But notes either side, horrendous. So you can't use this to sort of necessarily play in a pattern. You almost just need to kind of start like rolling a note and kind of fine tuning it, kind of getting the sound that you want, and then resample that. So. I've tried. It's really complicated. So you can kind of pitch, keynote map how much of this effect would be per each note, but to get it to like fit neatly, it's impossible. I mean, I've kind of dreamed of making a sound which has kind of, being able to choose how much kind of oscillation you want and beating, and then just kind of have it the same for every note on the keyboard. But in reality, it doesn't really work like that. But for me, this is like a really interesting way of kind of, if we turn up the distortion again, sorry, probably hear it a bit clearer now actually. And an alternative is to kind of use pitch bend, because kind of sweeping through these, you get some really cool textures as well. So I don't know if anyone here is like fans of noisier, but it's that kind of really like aggressive neuro-funk kind of sound. So yeah, another way to control it though, and it kind of leads us neatly on to the next section, is to add in some other modulation sources that we can kind of control ourselves. So I don't know if you can see here, but I have a Keith Macmillan Q Nexus. It's a very simple basic MPE controller. I mentioned earlier that there was some MPE and different MIDI modulators in the bottom that we can turn on here. So I've turned on one which is called MPE Timbre and another one that's called Pressure. I'll just do the pressure one to start with. If we look, so we're looking here. If I press a note, I can control like how hard I press is going to give me effectively a source of modulation. And so I've routed this to a whole bunch of different things. So this is where things can start to get really kind of convoluted or intricate, depending on which way you look at it. But I've got this depth control being controlled by pressure, essentially controlling the mix of this resonator snap-in. So the resonator is effectively going to trigger a, you can think of it a bit like a really steep EQ band around a particular frequency. And that again can be used to kind of create this kind of beating. And then also the mix on this flanger, so the harder I push, we're going to kind of introduce some kind of sweeping in the kind of top end. And then the main thing it's kind of also doing is this level. So our FM control, that I've called it, this sine wave volume, if you like, the level of that is being controlled by how hard I push. So the harder I push, let's get that down to 0, the more this is going to go up, and therefore the more the frequency is going to be modulated by our sine wave. So just to show you that again, as I push harder, you see that it's getting, the sine wave's getting bigger. And so that's one source of expression, if you like, that you can kind of play in. And the other is this MPE timbre. So for each of these little bars, you can kind of move your finger up and down. And you'll see I've kept it quite a narrow band because it's quite a sensitive thing. It gets a bit crazy. But you can see on the left there, as I move my finger up and down, it's going to be kind of controlling that as well. So I guess really there's kind of two workflows at this point. You can either just like hit record and make some crazy sounds and kind of wait till you hit some gold and then kind of just resample that. And then you might add some further processing or whatever else. Or you can kind of capture all the MPE data and what you're playing, and then kind of you can go in and edit that MIDI data. And it kind of depends on maybe your mood or which way you like to work, but both are quite effective. So we could perhaps try and do that actually now. So so if we're making some like, you know, filthy neurofunk and we want some really dirty sounds, we could just kind of, let's just hit record, see what we come up with. So that might be like a cool, oh, bugger. Oh no, yeah, sorry, it's on track alternatives. Bear with me, oh, it's on here. So yeah, that could have been like it wasn't perfect, but it was like a good sound for maybe like a end of the section going into a breakdown or something, or a cool sound just by itself in the breakdown. And so the bottom now, we've captured that MPE data, and if I can just kind of cycle through. There's the pitch bend. That was the either the pressure or the other one, I can't remember. And so we could kind of go in and fine tune this and kind of just loop it and kind of get a feel for what's going on. Or we could kind of hit record, and maybe we'll do that workflow a bit later on, because I kind of want to talk about 32-bit audio in that context as well, which we'll kind of come on to. Yeah, so we've looked at analog oscillators, we've looked at Wavetable briefly, we'll kind of maybe come back to that a bit later on as well. We can also use a sample. So again, we're sticking within like really the kind of familiar framework, just so you've got some context to here, but essentially, rather than having an oscillator, we've now got a sample. I think the one I actually meant to have in here was slightly different. Just grab that now. So this is a harmonica sample. I'll just turn everything off. We can hear how that sounds. just pitch down a bit. So just a like really basic, but quite kind of tonal sound. And we can then kind of start to use this as a sound source instead. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the start point because we don't want that kind of slow, breathy point. And I'm running it through our low pass filter. That's then going into a resonator and a frequency shifter. I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute, and then back through kind of our distortion and the same kind of chain that we've had at the end here. So let's just listen to how that can kind of affect things. Need to bring up the distortion. So just kind of almost like a distorted saw wave. And then we can start to kind of modulate, or sort of bring in some frequency modulation. So this is controlling the mix, as we saw before, where we're controlling the distortion mix. We're now going to control how much of the resonator and this frequency shifter are kind of added into the signal. And I've kind of just tuned these to be close to the original sample to kind of get that beating, but we can kind of tweak that as well. And that kind of movement in the low end is kind of like really powerful in a kind of sort of dance floor drum and bass context. And then again, using the macros here, we can kind of control the frequency of the frequency shifter and this resonator as well to kind of explore some different textures that way as well. And so you can kind of get into this and find some really nice textures to kind of resample, a bit like how we were doing with the original Reese Bass, but now kind of applying the same principles but to these kind of modern Reeses as well. I hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to see more videos like this, just head over to the DBS Institute YouTube channel now.